Hello everybody, and welcome to our 5th Facebook Live Lunch and Learn seminar. We're coming at you live from the Texas State Capitol today. We're actually just outside of the room where the House Public Education Committee usually meets. I'm Rachel Gandy, a policy fellow at Disability Rights Texas, and I'm here with David from the wonderful Communication by Hand. Today we're going to be talking to you about an education buzz term that we heard over and over again during the last legislative session. That's called response to intervention, or RTI. But before we dive into that, I do want to remind everyone that Disability Rights Texas is currently undergoing a community survey. We want to know what's most important in the lives of people with disabilities because our work should reflect your priorities and your experiences. So to take part in that survey, please go to www.drtx.org/survey. And as a bit of a bonus, each month we will be doing a bit of a raffle. So we'll pick a name of somebody who has participated in the survey, and you'll get a gift card. So if you want to participate, again, that's www.drtx.org/survey. We really appreciate your time and your insight. All right, so now let's get back to the topic of the day, and that's response to intervention, or RTI. I have some notes to go through, so bear with me. This is going to be a high-level overview, but if you have more specific questions, or if you want us to even do a follow-up event on this topic, feel free to put that in the comments, and we'll respond there. So today I'm going to go over what RTI is in theory, what it looks like in practice, what some of the problems have been in implementing this process, and how the legislature tried to deal with some of those issues during this last session. And then we'll close with some practical tips that you can use in your child's school. All right, so first and foremost, what is RTI? What's response to intervention? RTI is a school-wide, multi-tiered system of support that's designed to catch students who are struggling early so that we can connect them with the interventions and the instruction that they need to succeed. The concept was actually originally introduced into the general education mainstream through a special education law. It was through the 2004 reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. In that reauthorization, RTI was upheld as a way to help identify learning disabilities. And note that special education dollars can even be used to fund this general education process. Now remember, RTI is not a special education program, it's not a special ed process, and it's not a substitute for one either. It doesn't come along with the specialized and individualized instruction or the critical safeguards to which students with disabilities are entitled. Rather, in the RTI process, school administrators are targeting all students to make sure that we're catching those struggling learners early and connecting them with help. And this all happens in the general ed setting. Kids receive services of increasing intensity when they go through multiple layers, what's called tiers, in the RTI process. And at each tier, data are collected so that educators can make better informed decisions about the instruction that students are getting. And there are many stakeholders who should be involved in this process, from general educators to people involved in special education, specialists, and last, but of course not least in any way, parents. So the theory behind the program then is that all students should be receiving this high quality, scientifically based instruction. But what does this actually look like in practice? It turns out that can be a challenging thing to nail down because RTI looks different based on where you are. It may look very different in one campus than it does in another campus, even if they're in the same district. And that's because RTI is a process. It's not a prescribed program. Still, we want to make sure we give you a bit of an idea of what this could look like in your child's school. So usually, RTI is composed of about 3 tiers that could differ based on your campus. But in Tier 1, that typically serves about 80% of students adequately. This is the school-wide tier in which all students should be receiving that high-quality, scientifically based instruction. But kids also will get here universal screenings so that they can be identified if they're at risk or if they're possibly falling behind. And this service level may end up going on for several weeks before making a change or bumping up to a new tier. Now, if a student is identified as struggling and they need some extra support, then the educators may decide to bump them up to Tier 2, where about 15% of students are adequately served. So this tier involves targeted interventions. While Tier 1 is more of that school-wide, everyone is receiving that specific type of instruction, Tier 2 is targeted to a student's specific needs. So, for example, that may mean a student is struggling in reading, and so they need a bit of extra help in that area. To work, though, these services can't simply be providing a student with more time to, say, read a passage if reading is where they're struggling. Instead, this should focus on specific skills. So for that child, maybe phonics and reading comprehension. That way, a student can build the skill and generalize it moving forward. Most importantly, in this tier, and really in all of the tiers, is that data collection should be happening so that all the stakeholders are able to look at progress and make better decisions about what that student may need and what they best respond to. Now, if a student isn't progressing sufficiently and they need some more help from Tier 2, they could be bumped up to Tier 3 services. So this serves about 5% of students adequately. But what's key there is I talked about how these are kids who aren't progressing sufficiently. Unfortunately, this is usually ill-defined in schools, and it's not defined in IDEA either. But the hallmark really of this tier is not the type of service that's given, but rather the intensity of it. So it could look like more small group activities like those that are used in Tier 2, or it could even be one-on-one interventions like pull-outs from the classroom. Still, the emphasis here is on skill building, on feedback, and providing multiple opportunities for a student to respond. And monitoring here also is going to be kicked up a notch. The reality, though, is that RTI is based on local control. So how this plays out in your district and in your campus is going to differ based upon leadership buy-in and resources that are available. What has to be consistent, though, for this to actually be implemented with fidelity is the progress monitoring piece. I know I've talked about it a lot already, but what this means for you as a parent is that the school should have data on your student on how he or she is progressing, data that you can request, that you can analyze, and that can actually be used in a special education evaluation later on if you do suspect that your child has a disability. So the theory and the steps of this process seem to make sense on paper, but we have seen difficulties with the implementation of the RTI process, not only here in Texas, but across the country, where now almost every state, if not every state, is implementing some form of RTI. In recent years, the Department of Education has started to look more closely at this process because it's become so widespread. It's widely used, but we should note there's a bit of a lack of comprehensive research on the program as a whole rather than just pieces, and on things like how it impacts student behavior or improved math instruction, things other than reading usually. In 2015, the Department of Education released a study even finding that kids who were receiving RTI services were doing worse than their peers. And that's likely tied to the fact that a lot of campuses don't apply or implement RTI with fidelity to the model. Because constant data collecting and inclusive decision-making with parents is challenging. It takes time and it takes resources. And it's hard to get that done if teachers and other people implementing the process aren't trained properly and provided ongoing training. Just simply saying that your campus implements RTI and using that buzz term is not the same as actually implementing it with fidelity, and we need to hold schools accountable for that. Even before the study came out in 2015, though, the Department of Education also had to issue guidance to schools who were misusing RTI. So they had to remind districts that response to intervention cannot be used to delay or deny access to special education evaluations. Because what we've found all over the U.S. is that RTI supporters have touted this process as something that's separate and apart from special education. But in practice, it's often used as maybe a gateway or even a barrier to getting into the special education services to which a student with a disability may be entitled. In some places, schools were explicitly telling parents that you cannot get an evaluation until you've gone through each tier of RTI. That violates the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it ultimately hurts kids. The delay problem was even amplified in Texas, where over the past decade we've operated under the 8.5% cap on special education enrollment, something we've talked about many times during these Facebook Live events. So that incentivized districts to minimize special ed enrollment, and it meant that many kids with disabilities were waiting in a type of RTI purgatory for months, or even years without making sufficient progress, and sometimes without any parental knowledge at all. But thanks to parents, advocates, and legislators, this past session we were able to eliminate the 8.5% cap. Still, that culture of under-identification exists in Texas, and it's a harder nut to crack. But luckily, this past session, we did have legislators who wanted to address that culture of under-identification, and they looked at RTI as a way to do that. We know that from research and from our own experience that kids do better when parents are empowered with the information they need to get involved and to stay involved in their child's education. Silos and secrecy simply don't work in the education field if we're thinking about kids. So legislators, led by Senator Menendez and his wonderful staff, ended up passing SB 1153 to help that along. Now schools are actually required to provide you with certain information regarding RTI. Though that's in most of the models, that parent engagement is really important, we haven't seen it play out in practice in all campuses. So now, if your child is bumped up from that Tier 1 level of school-wide services to a more intense tier, then you should receive a notice. And that notice isn't just dropping a line saying, hey, your child is in Tier 2. They have to give details about things like descriptions of services that will be used, the data collected for your child at Tier 1, estimates of how long services will continue, timeframes for when you can get progress reports, and also information about special education evaluations. No longer can schools hide behind the false claim that an evaluation can only take place after a student has progressed through each tier of RTI. All RTI models and books and research encourage that parent involvement, but our culture of under-identification doesn't. So what this bill does is it tries to make sure that it's mandatory that parents receive information they need. You have a right to that information, and you shouldn't have to settle for anything less. But just like any other bill, SB 1153 doesn't solve all the problems that we've seen with RTI, and it doesn't amplify all of its advantages either. So staying vigilant is key. So before we close today, I know I'm sort of running out of time, I want to make sure I point out some tips that I've actually received from parents who have lived experience with this RTI system. So I do want to give a shout out to that parents who shared their experience with me and gave me some ideas of questions and things that parents can be asking their campus. So first of all, I want everyone to remember special education isn't a dirty term. We heard so many times while this bill was being debated that RTI can be an alternative, a way to get kids into the services they need without placing them in a special education classroom. But special education isn't a place. It's a set of individualized services and critical safeguards to which a student with a disability is entitled. RTI can work in tandem with special education, but it's not a replacement for it, even if that is cheaper for school administrators. Second, some parents did reach out and give some ideas of questions that you can proactively ask your district about RTI. And if these are questions that they should have answers to, if they don't, that's likely a sign that RTI isn't being implemented with fidelity. And that's something we should hold them accountable for. There are great training opportunities in Texas to fix that problem, but we have to bring it to light first. So some examples of questions. You could ask your school for a written statement describing the criteria used to transition a child from RTI to special education. This is a tricky area, so it's something everyone should be thinking about early and often in this process. Some other ideas brought to us by parents were for the district or the campus. How do you define students who are at risk and struggling? What are the strategies you use to identify them? Who provides these RTI intervention strategies, and how are they trained to do so? Where do you draw the line between distinct tiers in RTI? In other words, how can you quantitatively determine whether a child should be bumped up a tier or moved down a tier? So define really sufficient progress for us. How are you going to continue to keep me in the loop as my child progresses through RTI? And finally, walk me through the data you've collected. This is data that they should be collecting very often throughout the process, and it's something that you can sit down and have a conversation about. And then last but not least, for our kind of last tip of the day, is if you have any trouble, call us. If you're having trouble getting that special ed evaluation, if you haven't gotten the notice about RTI, or at least with all the information that's required, give us a call. We have attorneys and advocates across the state who are ready and willing to help you out. So you can call us at 1-800-252-9108, or we also have an online intake form. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I know I went through a ton of information. If you have questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, along with you'll see our infographic on this very topic there as well. Next week, at the same time in the same place, my colleague Stephen Alaman will be talking about another hot topic in special education, and that's cameras in the classroom. So you won't want to miss that. Be sure to tune in. And just as a last plug, make sure that you go and fill out our community survey. And again, you can find that at www.drtx.org/survey. Thank you guys so much for spending your lunchtime with me, and please feel free to reach out if you have questions. Thank you.